The Oregon Territory was an organized incorporated territory of the United States existing 10 and a half years from August 14, 1848 until February 14, 1859. It included the present-day states of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, along with parts of Wyoming and Montana. Before it became fully American-controlled land, it was a region under prolonged dispute between the United States and the United Kingdom. Within this territory ran the infamous Oregon Trail, a 2,170-mile wagon route stretching from the Missouri River to the valleys of Oregon, typically taking 4 to 6 months to complete. For perspective, the entire continental United States coast to coast is about 3,000 miles, meaning the Oregon Trail alone covered nearly 2/3 of that distance. Today, that journey is long but manageable. Back then, it was survival. There was no infrastructure, no emergency services, and in many cases, no reliable maps. Just terrain, weather, disease, and whatever went wrong along the way. And things went wrong often. Tonight, we follow one of the most infamous journeys ever taken on that trail, the Donner Party.
Hush, little baby, don't say a word.
This is a conspiracy channel.
Welcome to the Hush Channel. During the 1840s, thousands of settlers left their homes in the east, heading toward the Oregon Territory in California. Their goal was not random. They were aiming for land, stability, and opportunity, particularly in regions like Central California's Sacramento Valley, where places like Sutter's Fort near present-day Sacramento had already become known as key settlement points. To get there, settlers had two choices: an expensive and dangerous sea voyage around South America, or a months-long overland journey across the American frontier. Most chose the frontier, but not everyone was chasing the same thing. Some saw California, then still a part of Mexico, as a place where they could live more freely within a Catholic society, away from the Protestant-dominated structures they had known in the United States. Others were drawn by the West's rapidly growing economic opportunities, land ownership, trade, agriculture, and the possibility of building something from nothing. And then there were those driven by manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were divinely entitled to expand across the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific, a belief that justified everything and ignored everyone who was already there. Most wagon trains began in Independence, Missouri, moving west at about 10 to 15 miles per day. The journey typically lasted between 4 and 6 months. Travelers followed river systems like the Platte River, using them as natural guides across the plains, gradually working their way toward the Rocky Mountains. Their path led them to South Pass in present-day Wyoming, one of the few mountain crossings low and wide enough for wagons to pass through without extreme difficulty. From there, immigrants could choose between multiple routes depending on whether they were heading toward Oregon or California. Timing mattered. Leave too early and spring rains turned the trail into mud. Leave too late and the mountains would close with snow before you could cross them. In the spring of 1846, roughly 500 wagons set out from Independence. Near the back of that migration was a smaller, slower-moving group of 9 wagons. This group would become known as the Donner Party. That group did not form randomly. It began in Springfield, Illinois, where James Fraser Reed helped organize a small migration party that included the Donner families and several others preparing to head west together. They departed Springfield on April 14, 1846, moving toward Independence, Missouri, where they officially joined the larger westward migration on May 19th under a wagon train led by William H. Russell. From the very beginning, this was not just a loose collection of travelers, it was a structured group moving with intention. At the rear of the line was that group of 9 wagons carrying 32 members of the Donner and Reed families, along with hired workers responsible for handling livestock, equipment, and the daily labor required to keep a wagon train moving. Each head of household typically managed 3 wagons, 2 for supplies and 1 for family travel, a setup that reflected both preparation and the physical demands of crossing the continent. The patriarch of one of those families was George Donner, about 60 years old. Born in North Carolina, he had spent much of his life gradually moving west through Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois, following the same pattern as many others of his time: land, movement, opportunity, and then further west again. By 1846, he was living near Springfield, Illinois with his 44-year-old wife, Tamsin Donner, and their 3 daughters: Frances, 6, Georgia, 4, and Eliza, 3. George also had 2 older daughters from a previous marriage, Elitha, 14, and Leanna, 12. Tamsin's story brought a very different kind of strength into the party. She was born Tamsin Eustace in Newburyport, Massachusetts, on November 1st, 1801, and had spent much of her life supporting herself through teaching. She had taught from a young age, lived and worked in multiple states, and had endured profound loss before ever meeting George Donner. By the time she settled in Illinois and married George in 1839, she was not naive, fragile, or dependent. She was known as intelligent, capable, and deeply self-possessed. A woman who had already survived grief and upheaval long before the trail ever tested her. Accounts later described her as small in stature, but strong-willed, and even a good shot with a pistol. Traveling with George was his younger brother, Jacob Donner, 56, along with Jacob's wife, Elizabeth, 45. Their household was large and blended. Elizabeth brought 2 sons into the family, Solomon Hook, 14, and William Hook, 12, and together she and Jacob had 5 children: George, 9, Mary, 7, Isaac, 6, Louis, 4, and Samuel, 1, who was still just an infant. Also traveling with the Donners were hired teamsters, men responsible for managing the wagons, animals, and day-to-day labor of the journey. These included Hiram O. Miller, Samuel Shoemaker, Noah James, Charles Berger, John Denton, and Augustus Spitzer. They were not alone. Traveling alongside them, and just as important to this story, was another family. The Reed family, led by James Fraser Reed, was part of the same group. Reed's story did not begin on the trail. It began on November 14, 1800 in County Armagh, Ireland, where he was born before immigrating to the United States with his mother after his father's death. He spent part of his early life in Virginia, working as a clerk in a family store, learning trade and structure from a young age. By the mid-1820s, Reed had moved west into Illinois, where he became involved in multiple ventures including business, trade, and mining interests as the frontier expanded. He was not just a settler, he was building something. Reed served in the Black Hawk War of 1832, where he fought alongside a militia that included a young Abraham Lincoln, further tying him into the expanding American frontier network. In 1835, he married Margaret Backenstow, whose maiden name was Keyes, a widow who already had a daughter named Virginia. Together, they built a life in Springfield, Illinois, raising children and establishing themselves within the growing economy of the region. By the mid-1840s, Reed had achieved a level of financial stability that allowed him to do something many could not. He could organize his own westward migration. In 1845, he made the decision to go to California and helped organize the very group that would become the Donner Party. When they left Springfield in April of 1846, Reed was not following opportunity. He was actively pursuing and financing it, and it showed. Where most families traveled with modest, tightly packed wagons carrying only essentials, Reed's was larger, heavier, and visibly better equipped. What many described as a well-stocked prairie schooner carried more provisions than typical immigrants, even including items others would have considered unnecessary weight. He traveled with 3 wagons, including a specially built, more comfortable family wagon designed for travel rather than survival alone. Something so unusual for the trail that it became well known among the group. You could look at his setup and immediately tell he had more supplies, more security, more confidence. And that confidence translated into influence, because on the trail, the people who looked the most prepared often became the people others trusted. And Reed was one of those people. But wealth doesn't make you immune to bad decisions, and this journey would prove that quickly. Traveling with him was his wife, Margaret Reed, about 32 years old, her daughter, Virginia Reed, 12, his daughter Martha Jane Patty Reed, 8, and their young sons James Reed Jr., 6, and Thomas Reed, 3, along with Margaret's mother Sarah Keyes, who traveled with them as part of the household. The Reeds also brought their own hired workers: Milford Milt Elliott, James Smith, Walter Heron, Bayless Williams, and Eliza Williams, forming a structured working unit within the larger group. Within a week of leaving Independence, the Donners and Reeds joined a larger wagon train, and as they moved west, more families attached themselves along the way. The Murphy family, led by widow Levina Murphy, 37, traveled with a large extended household of 13 people that included 5 younger children, 2 married daughters, her son-in-laws, and young grandchildren. The Eddy family joined with 2 small children. The Breen family, a farming family with 7 children, became part of the group as well. The Breens were a family whose migration to the west was motivated by Catholicism. The Kesselberg family, German immigrants, joined alongside other individuals, single men, hired drivers, and travelers without strong family units nor family protection system, who moved in and out of the party's structure. Louis Kesselberg, born Johann Ludwig Christian Kesselberg in 1814 in Germany, was one of the most educated men in the Donner Party. He spoke multiple languages and had worked in a brewery before immigrating to the United States with his wife, Philippine, who was just 23, and their young daughter, Ada, who was 3 years old. They joined the Donner Party with other German immigrants, including workers and businessmen, forming a tight-knit group within the larger wagon train. But from early on, Kesselberg stood apart, not for his intelligence, but for his temperament. He was known to be quick-tempered, irritable, and was widely disliked by others in the party. There were also allegations that he was physically abusive toward his wife, which only deepened the distrust others had toward him, especially with her pregnancy becoming obvious as the trip proceeded. Later, the Graves family joined, bringing with them a large household that increased the size of the group significantly. By that point, the Donner Party had grown to 87 people, and that detail mattered more than they realized, because they were not at the front of the migration. They were at the back, as they were part of the last groups to leave that year, and being last meant less margin for error. At first, though, the trip still felt manageable. Hard, yes. Slow, yes. But not yet doomed. And that illusion, that feeling of control, is exactly what makes what happens next hit so much harder. For the first part of the journey, things moved the way journeys like this were expected to move. Slow, difficult, but manageable. The wagons rode westward from Missouri at an average of about 10 to 15 miles per day, following the established pattern of migration. They moved alongside river systems like the Platte, using water as both a guide and a lifeline. Days were long, but predictable. Nights were spent gathered around fires. Repairs were constant but routine. For roughly 2.5 to 3 months, from mid-April into late June of 1846, they crossed the Great Plains and pushed steadily toward the Rocky Mountains. By late June and into early July 1846, the immigrants reached Fort Bridger, located in what is now southwestern Wyoming, near the border of present-day Utah. It was here, at a point where decisions began to matter more than momentum, that they encountered the influence of a man who was not physically present but would shape everything that followed: Lansford Hastings. Hastings was a lawyer, a writer, and a promoter of westward expansion. He had published a guidebook titled The Immigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, encouraging settlers to head west. In it, he proposed what he described as a more direct route to California, a shortcut that would avoid the long curve of the traditional trail through southern Idaho along the Snake River Plain. According to Hastings, immigrants following the standard route would continue northwest from Wyoming into present-day Idaho, following the Snake River, before turning back southwest toward California. It was longer in distance, but it was known, tested, and supported by years of wagon traffic. Hastings offered something different. His route would cut southwest directly from Wyoming into Utah through the Wasatch Mountains and then across the Great Salt Lake Desert before reconnecting with the California Trail in present-day Nevada. He claimed it would save time. He claimed it would be easier. But in reality, the route added roughly 125 miles to the journey and had never been successfully traveled by large wagon trains. Much of what he promoted was based on limited personal travel and ambition rather than proven experience. To push this route, Hastings had riders deliver letters to immigrant groups along the trail. On July 12, 1846, the Donner and Reed group received one of these letters. In it, Hastings urged them to take his cutoff, warning them that they might face resistance from Mexican authorities in California and advising them to travel in large groups. He told them he had found a better road and that he would meet them at Fort Bridger to guide them himself. But when they arrived, Hastings was not there. The man who convinced them to take this route was nowhere on it. Instead, they relied on secondhand assurances. Jim Bridger, whose trading post stood to benefit from increased traffic, told them the route was manageable, that water would be available, and that the journey would be shorter by hundreds of miles. At Fort Laramie, earlier in the journey, James Reed had also encountered an old friend, James Kleiman, who had traveled west and warned him directly not to take Hastings' cutoff. He told him plainly that wagons would not make it through and that Hastings' claims were unreliable. Another traveler, Edwin Bryant, had gone ahead and, seeing the terrain for himself, left letters behind warning immigrants to avoid the route entirely. Those letters never reached the Donner Party. By July 20th, near the Little Sandy River in what is now Wyoming, the larger wagon train they had been traveling with split apart. Most continued along the established trail toward Fort Hall and the Snake River route. A smaller group, including the Donners and the Reeds, chose to break away and head toward Fort Bridger and the Hastings cutoff. This smaller group needed a leader. James Reed had military experience from his service in the Black Hawk War and had proven himself capable in organization and logistics, but his personality worked against him. He was seen by others as authoritative, sometimes rigid, and overly confident. In contrast, George Donner, older and more reserved, carried himself with a steady and charitable demeanor that people trusted. When the group made its decision, they chose George Donner as captain. At this point, the Donner Party consisted of dozens of individuals spread across dozens of wagons, but still only a fraction of the larger migration they had separated from. They were already behind the main body of travelers, and now they were alone. On July 31st, 1846, after resting and making repairs near Black's Fork of the Green River, located in present-day southwestern Wyoming, the Donner Party officially left the established trail and turned south onto Hastings' cutoff. From that moment forward, they were no longer following a road. They were following an idea. Within days, the difference became clear. The terrain did not resemble a shortcut. It resisted them. The Wasatch Mountains rose in front of them, steep and heavily wooded. There was no wagon road to follow. The men were forced to cut their own path, clearing trees, moving boulders, and carving a route through narrow canyons where wagons had to be lowered carefully to avoid breaking apart. Progress slowed to a crawl, at times averaging only a mile and a half per day. Time stretched, effort multiplied, and the landscape gave nothing back. In early August, they found one of Hastings' letters pinned to a tree, advising them to wait for him so he could guide them through a better route. Reed, along with Charles Stanton, a young, capable member of the party who had already proven reliable, and William Pike, another immigrant traveling with the group, rode ahead to find him. What they encountered instead were nearly impassable canyons, where stone had to be broken apart just to move forward. Hastings met them briefly but did not return with them. Instead, he pointed out a general direction and left them to navigate it alone. When Reed returned to the group 4 days later, they had a choice: turn back and lose time retracing their steps, or continue forward into terrain that was already proving worse than anything they had been promised. They chose to continue. By mid-August, as they pushed through the mountains, another group caught up to them. The Graves family, led by Franklin Graves, traveling with his wife Elizabeth, their children Mary, William, Eleanor, Lovina, Nancy, Jonathan, Franklin Jr., and their infant daughter Elizabeth, along with their married daughter Sarah, her husband Jay Fosdick, and a teamster named John Snyder. They added both numbers and pressure to the group. Their arrival brought the total number of immigrants to around 87 people, traveling in roughly 60 to 80 wagons. It also confirmed something critical. They were at the very back of that year's migration west. By August 20th, they reached a point in the mountains where they could finally see the Great Salt Lake in the distance. It should have felt like progress. Instead, it marked the beginning of something worse. The arguments started, quiet at first, then louder. Doubt spread through the group, not just about the route, but about the decisions that had led them there. Supplies were running low, especially among families who had started with less. The pace was uneven. Some pushed ahead, others lagged behind. The party began to fracture into smaller units. Around this time, Stanton and Pike, who had ridden ahead earlier, became lost. When the group finally found them again, they were so desperate they were on the verge of eating their own horses to survive. On August 25th, Luke Halloran, a young man who had joined the party in hopes that the journey west would improve his failing health, died of tuberculosis. Not long after, the party found another message from Hastings, torn, scattered, and pieced back together. It warned of 2 days and 2 nights of hard travel ahead. with no grass and no water. The immigrants rested their oxen, gathered what strength they could, and prepared to cross. They had no real understanding of what they were about to enter. After 36 hours of difficult travel through rising terrain, they reached a ridge. From the top, they could see it, a vast, flat expanse stretching endlessly ahead. White, empty, silent. The Great Salt Lake Desert, one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. On August 30th, 1846, they began the crossing. The desert did not behave the way they expected. During the day, the heat pulled moisture up through the salt crust, turning the ground into a thick, sticky mass. Wagon wheels sank deep into it, sometimes up to their hubs. The sun did not just beat down from above. It reflected off the white salt beneath them, rising back up into their faces, surrounding them in heat from every direction. Oxen slowed, then stopped. Some refused to move at all, standing still in the heat, their tongues swollen from thirst. The desert stretched. It stretched further than expected. It stretched longer than expected. The crossing, which had been described as a manageable distance of about 40 miles, turned into a brutal 80 to 90 mile stretch with little to no water. What should have taken 1 to 2 days extended into nearly a full week. Time slipped. Animals broke under the strain. 9 of James Reed's oxen, driven mad by thirst, bolted into the desert and disappeared. Other families lost cattle and horses the same way. Wagons were abandoned where they could no longer be pulled. Supplies had to be redistributed, often unevenly. The structure of the journey, the sense that everything was organized and controlled, began to collapse. And still, they moved forward. Mirages appeared on the horizon, shimmering illusions of water, of trees, of wagon trains ahead of them. Some believed they had finally caught up to Hastings. Others knew better, but said nothing. By the time they reached water on the far side, they were changed. And when they finally reached water, nobody celebrated. They spent days recovering at the springs beyond the desert, gathering what remained of their animals, redistributing supplies, and trying to salvage what they had lost. It was here that Reed, recognizing the growing instability, pushed for more centralized control, asking families to account for their food and goods. He also proposed sending men ahead to Sutter's Fort in California to secure supplies. Volunteers stepped forward, including Charles Stanton and William McCutcheon, another member of the party who had joined along the route. They left ahead of the group, riding west toward California. The rest continued on. By mid-September, they crossed another stretch of desert, shorter but still punishing, and then moved into the valley near the Ruby Mountains in present-day northeastern Nevada. The terrain softened. Travel became easier. For a moment, it felt like they had survived the worst of it. On September 26, 1846, nearly 2 months after leaving the main trail, the Donner Party finally rejoined the established California Trail along the Humboldt River. They had lost a month. That month wasn't just time. It was the difference between dry ground and snow, between crossing the Sierra Nevada and being buried inside it. Up to this point, every problem had an answer. After this, problems started stacking faster than solutions. They had lost a month, and they didn't yet understand that they had just spent the only time they had left. By the time the Donner Party rejoined the California Trail along the Humboldt River on September 26, 1846, they had already been on the road for over 5 months. 5 months of movement, 5 months of decisions, 5 months of believing they were still on schedule, but they weren't. The land ahead had already changed. From the Humboldt River in what is now Nevada, the trail led west toward the Sierra Nevada, a massive mountain range forming a natural barrier between the interior of the continent and California. Under normal conditions, immigrants aimed to cross those mountains no later than early October. After that, the risk of snow increased rapidly. Not light snow, not something temporary. Snow that stayed, snow that buried trails, snow that turned passes into walls. And they were arriving at the edge of it, right at that line. At first, the terrain did not reflect the danger. The Humboldt River Valley allowed for steady travel. The ground was more forgiving than what they had just crossed. The pace improved. Wagons moved more easily. After everything they had endured through the cutoff, it felt briefly like recovery. But recovery can be deceptive when you're already too late. Food was still low. Animals were still weak. And the group, though still moving together, was no longer unified the way it had been at the start. Smaller clusters had formed. Some families moved ahead. Others lagged behind. The strain of the desert had not disappeared. It had settled into the way they traveled, the way they made decisions, the way they trusted each other, and time continued to move. As they followed the Humboldt River westward into October, they encountered groups of Paiute indigenous Americans living in the region. Some of them joined the immigrants for a couple of days, traveling alongside the wagon train, but the relationship quickly shifted. Several oxen and horses were stolen or shot during these encounters. Livestock began to disappear. Oxen were taken in the night. Horses were driven off. These were not small losses. Each loss slowed them down. Each loss pushed them further behind. And by now, it was already October. The Donner families moved ahead in an effort to make better time, placing George Donner and his group roughly a full day ahead of the main body of the wagon train. The rest of the party followed behind in a stretched out line that was no longer functioning as a single unit. It was here, on October 6, 1846, that the tension finally broke. Two wagons became entangled along the trail. One involved a team being handled by Milt Elliott, a hired teamster under James Reed. The other involved John Snyder, the teamster traveling with the Graves family. Snyder had already developed a reputation for aggression. What began as frustration turned violent. Snyder began beating the oxen. Reed intervened. Snyder turned on him, striking him repeatedly with the handle of a whip. When Reed's wife, Margaret, attempted to intervene, she was struck as well. In that moment, Reed reacted. He drew a knife and stabbed Snyder. The wound was fatal. The party stopped moving. That evening, the immigrants gathered to decide what to do. There was no formal law here. They were beyond American jurisdiction, in territory still under Mexican control. Wagon trains enforced their own justice. George Donner, their chosen leader, was not present. He was a full day ahead, so the decision fell to those behind. Some argued Reed should be hanged. Others hesitated. Snyder had struck first. Margaret had been struck, but Snyder had been liked. Reed had not. In the end, they chose a compromise. Reed would be banished. His wife pleaded for his life. The group agreed to spare him, but he would have to leave immediately and continue alone towards Sutter's Fort in California. His family would remain behind. Reed initially refused, but eventually he agreed. The next morning he left. He was sent out unarmed, but not completely alone. His stepdaughter, Virginia, 13 years old, not legally adopted but known to everyone as Virginia Reed, rode ahead secretly and found him. She brought him a rifle. She brought him food. Then she returned to the wagon train. Reed continued west on his own. Behind him, the party changed. The structure that had held them together was beginning to collapse. Families began looking out for themselves. Trust weakened. Cooperation became conditional. Grass grew scarce. Animals weakened further. People were forced to walk more to lighten the loads, and not everyone could keep up. An older man named Hardcoop, traveling with the Kaiserberg family, recent immigrants from Germany, had been relying on their wagon for transport because he was no longer physically able to keep pace on foot. As resources became more strained and the animals weakened, Louis Kaiserberg forced him out of the wagon, telling him he would have to walk or be left behind. Days later, Hardcoop was seen sitting beside a stream, his feet swollen so badly they had split open. No one stayed. He was never seen again. Loss followed loss. More livestock disappeared. More were stolen. By this point, nearly 100 oxen and cattle were gone. The party was running out of everything that made movement possible. Further along, a man named Wolfgang Wolfinger stopped to cache his wagon near the Humboldt Sink. Two men, Reinhardt and Augustus Spitzer, remained with him. They returned alone, claiming he had been killed. No one went back. The trail did not allow it. Another stretch of desert still lay ahead. Families abandoned wagons. Supplies were left behind. The journey became something stripped down to its barest form: move or be left. Meanwhile, Reed, traveling ahead, eventually caught up with the Donner families. He continued west with one of his teamsters, Walter Heron, and the two shared a single horse, allowing them to move far faster than the rest of the immigrants, sometimes covering 25 to 40 miles in a single day. After a brutal journey during which he nearly starved, Reed reached Sutter's Fort in the Sacramento Valley on October 28, 1846. He had made it, but the story did not resolve there. After only 2 days of rest, Reed attempted to return east with supplies for his family. He never made it back. Snow had already begun to close the mountain passes. The early onset of winter, earlier than expected, earlier than prepared for, blocked his return completely, and behind him the Donner Party was still moving toward those same mountains, unaware of how little time they had left. By mid-October, the air turned colder. Frost settled into the ground. Breath became visible in the morning. Still, they believed they could make it. They had to. As they approached the Sierra Nevada, near present-day Truckee, California, the terrain rose again, the forest thickened, the climb began, and then, on October 28th, the same day Reed reached safety, the first snow fell in the mountains. Not a storm that trapped them immediately, but the beginning of something that would not stop. Some recognized what it meant. Others believed it would pass. Because up to this point, every obstacle had eventually cleared. The snow did something else too. It quieted everything. Sound didn't carry the same weight anymore. The creak of wagons dulled. Footsteps softened. Even voices seemed to disappear into it. It was a kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the world itself was closing in. So they kept going, upward, into the mountains, into narrowing paths, into colder air. The wagons slowed, the animals weakened further. Progress began to slip again, and still they pushed forward, because turning back was no longer an option, and stopping still didn't feel real. The mountains did not close all at once. They closed slowly, quietly, and by the time it became clear what was happening, they were already inside it. By the time the Donner Party reached the Humboldt River in present-day Nevada, it was no longer late summer. It was October 1846. Nearly 6 months had passed since they left Illinois in April. What had begun as a structured migration now felt stretched thin, worn down by delay after delay, mistake after mistake. The river itself should have been a relief. Water, movement, a guide west. But even here, nothing came easy. For a short time, they encountered Paiute indigenous people, part of a larger group of indigenous nations whose homelands stretched across what is now Nevada, eastern California, southern Oregon, and parts of Utah. Before American expansion, Paiute communities lived throughout the Great Basin, adapting to an environment of deserts, rivers, and seasonal movement. They were not a single, unified group, but consisted of northern Paiute and southern Paiute bands, each with their own territories, leadership, and life ways. They relied on deep environmental knowledge, gathering, fishing, and hunting across land that outsiders often misunderstood as empty or barren. By the 1840s, increasing migration along trails like the one the Donner Party followed was already disrupting these lands, straining resources and creating tension. Today, Paiute communities still exist, with federally recognized tribes in Nevada, California, Utah, and Oregon, maintaining cultural traditions despite displacement and colonization. At first, the interaction seemed neutral, even cooperative, but within days, that shifted. Oxen and horses began disappearing, some stolen, some shot. The party was already operating on the edge of survival, and these losses hit hard. Livestock was not just transportation. It was food, labor, and the only way forward. Every animal lost meant less distance covered, less strength left, less time, and time was already gone. The structure of the group began to break. Families no longer moved as one unit. They spread out, each trying to move at their own pace, each trying to preserve what little they had left. Trust began to thin. People started looking inward, focusing on their own survival rather than the collective movement west. Grass became scarce along the riverbanks. The animals weakened further. To keep them moving at all, people were forced to walk instead of ride. Wagons grew heavier with every mile, even as supplies dwindled. The balance between what they carried and what they could carry was collapsing. And this is the part that is easy to read past, but impossible to live through. By this point, some of these people were no longer traveling in wagons at all. They were on foot, walking mile after mile through northern Nevada, along the Humboldt River Basin, an environment that even today is isolated, dry, and unforgiving. Back then, it was worse. No roads, no markers, no certainty, just open land stretching in every direction, broken by dust, scrub, and heat that rose off the ground and sat in the air. The sun didn't just beat down. It reflected back up from the pale earth, intensifying everything. Days were exhausting. Nights were cold. Their shoes wore down. Their bodies broke down, and they did not know how far they had left to go. They had already been traveling for nearly half a year, and now the only way forward for some of them was to walk beside weakened animals through unfamiliar land with no guarantee that the next water source would be enough or even there at all. The idea of not making it was no longer distant. It was right there, walking with them. And by this point, the losses were no longer just animals or supplies. Earlier along the trail, weeks before reaching the Humboldt, a woman named Sarah Keyes, who was traveling with the Reed family as Margaret Reed's mother, had already been gravely ill with tuberculosis when the journey began. The constant movement, the dust, the exhaustion, it accelerated everything. She did not make it far into the journey. She died early on and was buried at a place the immigrants came to call Alcove Springs. At the time, her death had felt like a contained loss, something mourned, but still distant from what the journey would become. Now, as the party unraveled along the Humboldt, it no longer felt distant. It felt like a warning they had already ignored. But what is harder to grasp is what that kind of loss does to people in the middle of movement. When grief does not get to stop the world, there is no returning home, no proper burial among family, no time to sit with it. They buried her in unfamiliar land, marked only by memory, and whatever stones or markers they could manage, knowing they would likely never pass that place again, and then they had to keep walking. That is a different kind of grief. It is unfinished. It lingers. It sits in the background while decisions still have to be made, meals still have to be rationed, children still have to be cared for. For Margaret Reed and her family, that loss did not end at the grave. It traveled with them, and in a journey already filled with uncertainty, it added something heavier than anything they were carrying. The realization that if one person could be left behind like that, any of them could. By the time the Donner Party reached the Truckee River, it was mid to late October 1846. The land had changed again, but this time it changed in a way that felt almost deceptive. The Truckee River runs along the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada, beginning at Truckee Lake, what is now called Donner Lake, and flowing northeast through what is now Truckee, California, before continuing into the Nevada desert toward Pyramid Lake. Back then, the immigrants did not know its full course, but they understood what they were looking at. Fresh moving water cutting through a high mountain valley lined with dense pine forests, rising granite slopes, and air that was noticeably colder than anything they had felt since leaving the plains. After months of dust, desert crossings, and the salt-crusted emptiness of the Great Basin, this place felt alive. The river moved steadily, clear and cold. The ground supported grass and trees. There was shade, there was water, there was something that resembled relief, but the timing told a different story. They had lost nearly a month on the Hastings cutoff, and that delay had followed them all the way here. Now, standing along the Truckee River at the base of the Sierra Nevada, they were no longer traveling ahead of winter. They were walking directly into it. Snow had not yet buried the land, but the cold had already settled in. The air carried that sharp edge that comes just before a season turns fully. By October 20th, 1846, the party faced a decision that should have been simple, but wasn't. The mountains ahead were known to be far worse than the Wasatch Range they had already struggled through. Steeper, colder, less forgiving. They had heard reports from Sutter's Fort that the pass ahead, what is now called Donner Pass, would remain open until mid-November. That gave them a narrow window, but everything about their condition worked against it. Their animals were exhausted, their wagons were failing, food was already running low, and many of them, men, women, and children, were physically worn down in ways that slowed them just enough to matter. Then something happened that forced their hand. A man named William Pike, an immigrant traveling with the larger wagon train, was killed when a firearm being handled by another immigrant, William Foster, discharged accidentally. It was sudden, unplanned, and it pushed the group forward. Family by family, they began moving into the mountains. The Breen family went first, then the Kiesebergs, then Charles Stanton, who had previously gone ahead to California for supplies, traveled alongside the Reed family. The Graves family followed, then the Murphy family. The Donners, as before, remained toward the rear. The climb began. The path followed the Truckee River upward. At first, it was manageable. Then it steepened. The air cooled further. Wagons strained. Animals hesitated. Progress slowed. And then another setback. One of the Donner wagons broke an axle. George Donner and his brother Jacob went into the woods to cut timber and shape a replacement by hand. It was slow work, physical, precise, and while doing it, George Donner slipped and drove a chisel deep into his hand. At first, it seemed minor, painful, but manageable, something that could be wrapped and endured. But out here, there were no doctors, no medicine, no sterile tools, no way to properly clean or treat a wound like that. Infection came quickly in conditions like these. What should have healed became something dangerous almost immediately. While they worked, the weather shifted. Snow began to fall. It didn't stop. Ahead, the families who had gone first reached higher elevation. The Breens made it to Truckee Lake and took shelter in an abandoned cabin. The Kesselbergs and the Eddy family attempted to cross the pass but were turned back by deep snow. Within a day, most of the party gathered at Truckee Lake, except for the Donners. They remained behind at Alder Creek, separated and exposed. At Truckee Lake, around 60 people, members of the Breen, Graves, Reed, Murphy, Keseberg, and Eddy families, crowded into 3 rough cabins. Dirt floors, no doors, no windows, roofs patched with oxhide and canvas. At Alder Creek, the Donner families built tents for shelter. Then on November 4th, the storm came. It lasted 8 days. The mountains sealed shut. Food became everything. The oxen began to die. Their bodies froze where they fell. The lake held fish, but most did not know how to catch them. Hunting failed more than it succeeded. Inside the cabins, people boiled oxhide into a glue-like substance. Bones were boiled until they crumbled. Children roasted pieces of hide. Mice were caught and eaten. Weakness spread. People stopped moving. At this point in their journey, they were just less than 100 miles from safety at Sutter's Fort, what should have been about a week's journey. At Alder Creek, Jacob Donner died. His body gave out under the combined weight of cold, starvation, and exhaustion. George Donner's infected hand worsened, leaving fewer men able to work. At Truckee Lake, Augustus Spitzer died. Bayless Williams died. Both had been part of the labor force that kept things moving. At this point, staying meant dying, so they made a plan. Franklin Graves built 14 pairs of snowshoes using oxbows and rawhide. On December 16th, 17 people left Truckee Lake on foot to cross the mountains. This group included William Eddy and members from several families. With them were 2 Miwok men, Luis and Salvador, indigenous men from the Central California region who had been working under John Sutter and brought back as guides by Charles Stanton. They entered snow as deep as 12 feet. By the 3rd day, many were snowblind from sunlight reflecting off the snow. By the 6th day, food was gone. Charles Stanton stopped, saying he would follow later. He never did. The group became lost. Hunger took over. A man named Patrick Dolan suggested someone should die so the others could eat. Nothing was decided before a blizzard forced them to stop. Then people began to die. Antonio died first. Franklin Graves followed. Dolan died after descending into delirium, and then the boundary broke. Some began eating the dead. Not all agreed. William Eddy, along with Luis and Salvador, refused at first. After 3 days of rest, the group set out again, searching for the trail. Hunger had stripped away whatever resistance remained. Eddy eventually succumbed and ate human flesh, though even that did not last long. Soon, there was nothing left again. They began tearing apart their snowshoes, eating the oxhide webbing that had once kept them moving across the snow. At that point, the idea shifted. They began discussing killing Luis and Salvador for food. Eddy warned the 2 men quietly, without confrontation, without argument. Luis and Salvador left the group in the night. By morning, the group had lost them and lost what little structure remained. That same night, Jay Fosdick died. Only 7 remained. Eddy and Mary Graves went out to hunt and managed to bring back deer meat. But when they returned, Fosdick's body had already been cut apart and eaten. Time lost meaning. Days blurred together. After several more days, 25 since they had first left Truckee Lake, the survivors came across Luis and Salvador again. They had not eaten in days. They were near death. At that point, William Foster acted. He shot both men. Their bodies were butchered and the flesh was dried for food. The act was not hidden. It was known among survivors. But later accounts would note that Foster was not heavily condemned for it, and that lack of consequence reflected something deeper about the time, an attitude spoken plainly by later observers that indigenous lives were often treated as if they mattered less. The survivors continued moving. More died. Eventually, what remained of the group reached an indigenous encampment. The people there, likely Miwok or neighboring groups, initially fled at the sight of them. When they returned, they gave what they could: acorns, pine nuts, grass. From there, William Eddy continued on and reached a settlement near the Sacramento Valley. News began to spread. Back at Truckee Lake and Alder Creek, the rest of the Donner Party remained, waiting, starving, and buried deeper with every passing storm. By the time word finally reached California, the situation in the mountains had already crossed a line that could not be undone. The first survivors to come out of the Sierra Nevada arrived in January of 1847, and they did not arrive as travelers. They arrived as witnesses, thin, disoriented, carrying a story that people struggled to process. At first, what they said sounded exaggerated. Then, the details began to repeat. Families trapped at Truckee Lake, others stranded at Alder Creek, food gone, people dying, and some doing things no one wanted to say out loud. Among those already in California was James Reed. Reed had made it out months earlier. After his banishment, he crossed the mountains alone and reached Rancho Johnson in late October 1846 before continuing to Sutter's Fort, where he arrived on October 28th. He was alive, but barely, and once he recovered enough to think clearly, his attention shifted immediately back to the mountains. Every day that passed without word made it worse. He pleaded with Colonel John C. Fremont to organize a rescue, even promising to join his forces in the Mexican-American War if it meant saving his family. But California at that moment was unstable. The war had pulled most able-bodied men away. Communication was fractured. Supplies were limited. Rescue was not a priority for many. It was a risk. Reed continued anyway. He joined with William McCutcheon and members of the Harlan Young wagon train, forming a small relief attempt. They pushed into the mountains, only to be turned back by impassable snow near Emigrant Gap, within miles of the trapped families. That moment confirmed what Reed feared most. The Donner Party was not delayed. They were trapped. The first survivors to come out of the Sierra Nevada in early January 1847 were members of a desperate escape group that had left Truckee Lake on December 16, 1846. Later known as the Forlorn Hope. 17 men, women, and children had set out on foot using makeshift snowshoes, hoping to cross the mountains and reach help. Only a handful survived the journey, including William Eddy, about 28, Mary Graves, about 20, William Graves, about 18, and Sarah Graves Fosdick, about 22. By the time they reached California, they were starving, physically broken, and carrying first-hand knowledge of what was happening in the mountains. Their accounts of families trapped at Truckee Lake and Alder Creek, of starvation, and of people resorting to cannibalism initially sounded unbelievable, but as more details aligned, they became the first credible witnesses to the full scale of the disaster unfolding behind them. Their arrival, in alignment with Reed's efforts, set the rescue missions in full motion. As word spread, communities responded. Petitions were created. Money was raised. Reports, some including cannibalism, circulated through newspapers, building urgency. Finally, in early February 1847, the first official relief party left the Sacramento Valley, led in part by William Eddy. They battled rain, swollen rivers, and deepening snow, caching food along the way. Of those who started, only 7 pushed all the way through. On February 18th, they reached Truckee Lake. They called out, and a woman, Levina Murphy, emerged from the snow and asked, "Are you men from California, or do you come from heaven?" What they found inside the camps was devastation. Cabins buried, roofs sagging, ox-hide coverings rotting. The smell was overwhelming. 13 people were already dead and partially buried near the structures. The survivors were emaciated. Some were too weak to stand. Others drifted in and out of awareness. Food was given carefully. Too much at once would kill them. They had to choose who could leave. They could not take everyone. At Alder Creek, George Donner was still alive, but barely. His hand had become gangrenous, the infection spreading through his body. He could not move. Around him, the camp had already begun to collapse. Jacob Donner had already died there. Not long after, his wife Elizabeth followed. There was no burial, no marker, just bodies left in the frozen camp, like so many others who would not leave those mountains. The cold preserved them where they lay, suspended in place as the living struggled to survive around them. At Truckee Lake, 23 people were selected to leave with the first relief. Others were left behind with promises that more help would come. Reed found his family, his wife Margaret, his children, his stepdaughter Virginia, still young. They were alive, but barely. He took them out with the group, but not all of his children could continue. Patty and Thomas became too weak to cross the snowdrifts, and no one had the strength to carry them. Margaret Reed faced an impossible decision: leave 2 children behind or risk losing all of them. She moved forward with the others, securing a promise from rescuer Aquila Glover that someone would return for them. A second relief came, then a third. Each time, fewer people remained. At Alder Creek, George Donner finally died from infection and starvation. The wound that had begun as a simple cut had become fatal in a place without medicine, without care, without any way to stop what was spreading through him. Tamsin Donner, after briefly checking on her daughters, returned to him. She had been given the chance to leave. She refused. She chose to stay. After George Donner died, she wrapped his body in a sheet, an attempt at dignity in a place where even that was difficult. She remained in that camp for a short time longer before making her way toward the lake cabins. She never made it back out. Accounts differ on exactly how she died, but what is consistent is that she reached the camp where Louis Keseberg was staying and died shortly after, likely from exhaustion, starvation, and exposure. Her body, like so many others, was never formally buried. Later accounts, some disputed, some widely repeated, state that her remains were consumed. By the time a salvage party returned in April, her body was gone. The mountains had taken her completely. At Truckee Lake, what remained of the party had been reduced to almost nothing. When later rescuers returned, they found Louis Keseberg alive, surrounded by evidence of what had taken place: human remains, personal belongings, and items taken from the dead, including money that had belonged to the Donner family. A lot had occurred that winter. Keseberg's wife, Philippine Keseberg, about 23 years old, and their young daughter Ada, about 3, both left Truckee Lake with one of the early relief parties in February 1847. Philippine was already severely weakened from starvation and exhaustion, but she survived the journey out of the mountains. Their daughter Ada, however, did not. She died during that same escape attempt and was buried in the snow by the rescuers. By the time Keseberg himself was rescued in April, he had already lost both of his children, his infant son and his daughter, but his wife was still alive. During the winter at Truckee Lake, Keseberg's wife gave birth to a baby boy, Louis Keseberg Jr., but in the conditions they were living in, cold, starvation, no medical care, the child did not survive. On January 24, 1847, the infant died and was buried in the snow by his mother. It was one of many losses that winter, but one that marked a shift. Children were no longer surviving simply because they were young. As starvation worsened, even that boundary did not hold. Keseberg later admitted that he had consumed the body of his infant son after the child's death. At that time, his wife was still at the camp. Whether she witnessed or participated in it is unknown. By the time rescuers reached the camps in April 1847, Keseberg was the last survivor found alive. What they discovered around him shaped everything that followed. He was found alone, wrapped in a blanket, surrounded by human bones. Nearby was a pot containing what appeared to be freshly cooked human remains, organs that had not yet been fully consumed. To the rescuers, this wasn't just survival. It looked excessive, prolonged, something beyond necessity. There were other details that made people suspicious. Keseberg admitted to cannibalism. It was also reported that he told William Eddy that he had eaten Eddy's son, something that horrified him and led Eddy to swear he would kill Keseberg if they ever met again in California. There were also accusations, some proven, some not, that Keseberg had taken valuables from the dead, including money belonging to Tamsin Donner. When confronted, he claimed that Tamsin had given it to him to pass on to her children. Others did not believe him. And then there was Tamsin herself. Tamsin Donner's body was never recovered. According to Keseberg, she had arrived at his shelter exhausted and freezing after leaving Alder Creek. He claimed he tried to warm her, but she died during the night. By morning, her body was no longer there, but rescuers didn't fully accept that version of events. He was the last person known to have seen her alive. He was found surrounded by human remains, and one rescuer later claimed that Keseberg had said her flesh was the best he had ever tasted, a statement Keseberg strongly denied for the rest of his life. There was never proof that he killed her, but there was never proof that he didn't consume her either. And in a place where survival had already crossed so many lines that uncertainty became enough. By the time the final rescue efforts ended in the spring of 1847, the numbers told a story that was as clear as it was devastating. Roughly 87 people had set out together on that journey west. Only 48 survived. Nearly half of the party was gone, lost along the trail in the desert. at Truckee Lake and at Alder Creek. Some had died early, like Sarah Keys, Margaret Reed's mother, who was around 70 years old when she died of tuberculosis and was buried at Alcove Springs. At the time, her death had felt like an isolated tragedy. By the end, it had become something else entirely, a quiet beginning to what would follow. Others died in the mountains where death was no longer sudden, but slow. Starvation, exposure, infection, weakness that stretched over days until the body simply stopped. And in the most extreme moments, survival crossed a line that none of them had imagined when they first left Missouri. At Alder Creek, the Donner family suffered some of the deepest losses. George Donner, about 60 years old, died from infection and starvation after his injured hand became gangrenous. His brother Jacob Donner, about 56, died before him, followed by Jacob's wife Elizabeth Donner, about 45. By the time death reached the Alder Creek camp, it did not come cleanly, and it did not end cleanly either. Jacob Donner, the older brother of George Donner, was one of the first to die there. When rescuers later reached the camp, they found what remained of him, and the condition of his body told a story without needing words. His remains had been disturbed, dismembered, and later accounts from survivors confirmed what that meant. At some point after his death, as food completely disappeared, his body had been used for survival. Exactly who did what is not fully clear in the historical record, but what is clear is that the boundary had already been crossed at Alder Creek. The living had begun to rely on the dead. Unlike his brother, there is no strong evidence that George Donner's body was consumed. Instead, accounts indicate that he was later buried by those who came through the mountains after the tragedy. According to Virginia Reed, who survived the ordeal and later wrote about it, the Reed family did not eat human flesh, even during the worst stages of starvation. It is one of the few claims from that winter that has remained consistent in both her account and later historical interpretations, while others were forced into decisions that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The Reeds endured starvation without crossing that line. Levina Murphy, about 46 years old, did not survive. She had been one of the central figures at Truckee Lake, caring for children and holding together what remained of her family. Her son, Simon Murphy, about 8, survived. Several of the Murphy children survived, while others did not. Her story, like many others, ended in the mountains, but her children carried it forward. Louis Kesselberg, about 32 years old, survived. Originally from Germany, he had immigrated to the United States before joining the journey west. His survival came with suspicion. When rescuers found him, he was surrounded by human remains and belongings taken from the dead, including items from the Donner family. Accusations followed him for the rest of his life of theft, of violence, and of what had happened in those final days. He denied some things, admitted to others, but his name became permanently tied to the darkest version of the story. After the rescue, Kesselberg did not return to a normal life. He briefly worked under John Sutter, a Swiss immigrant and landowner who had established Sutter's Fort in the Sacramento Valley, one of the first major settlements in the region and a key destination for westward migrants, even captaining a small vessel transporting goods along the river. But those who traveled with him reported that he unsettled them. It was said that he would cry out in his sleep. Some claimed he moved slowly on purpose, as if delaying travel, and rumors spread that he might wait for passengers to weaken so they could fall asleep and he could eat them. Whether those fears were real or imagined, they were enough. People avoided him, and he lost that work. He later found some success during the California Gold Rush. In 1851, he opened a small hotel in Sacramento called the Lady Adams. For a short time, it did well, but it burned down within a year. He rebuilt again, purchasing a bar and converting it into the Phoenix Brewery. That business thrived and became one of the first places in Sacramento known for producing lager beer. But once again, everything was lost. This time in the Great Flood of 1862, which destroyed the brewery and much of what he had built. At different points, Kesselberg also operated or was associated with establishments that served food and drink, and it was here that the rumors followed him most heavily. People whispered about what he had done in the mountains, and those whispers did not stay in the past. Some believed he had developed a taste for human flesh. Others went further, questioning what he might be serving to those who came through his doors. There is no evidence that he ever harmed anyone after the Donner Party or served anything other than normal food, but the suspicion suspicion was enough. Many avoided eating anything connected to him at all. Keseberg went on to have a large family, fathering a total of 11 children over the course of his life, though many did not survive to adulthood. His wife, Philippine, who had endured the journey and its aftermath with him, died years later in 1877. By that point, much of what they had rebuilt together had already begun to fade. Keseberg continued to try to rebuild his life, opening a distillery and taking on different work, but his reputation never left him. He became a man people whispered about, a man others avoided. The story of the mountains followed him everywhere he went. At one point, he attempted to clear his name by filing a defamation lawsuit against one of the men who had accused him of murder. A member of the rescue team, he won the case, but was awarded only $1 and was forced to pay the legal costs himself. It did little to change how people saw him. Years later, a historian named Charles McGlashan arranged a meeting between Keseberg and Eliza Donner Houghton, the youngest daughter of Tamsin Donner, who had been a small child during the tragedy. Keseberg swore to her that he had not killed her mother. He wept as he spoke, insisting that he had done what he could, that he had not taken her life. Eliza chose to believe him. Others never did. As time went on, Keseberg's life narrowed. Many of his children died before him. By the end of his life, he had lost nearly everything: his family, his stability, and whatever chance he had at leaving the past behind. He died in 1895 in a hospital for the poor in Sacramento at the age of 81. There was no ceremony, no recognition, and no grave that can be found today. His story did not end in the mountains, but it never left them either. Many of the hired men did not survive. These included Hiram O. Miller, John Denton, about 28, Samuel Shoemaker, Augustus Spitzer, and Bayless Williams. These men were responsible for driving wagons, handling livestock, and doing the physical labor that kept the journey moving. Some died along the trail. Others died in the mountains. Their names are often listed, but their stories are rarely told in full, and for most of them, there is very little left behind. John Denton, about 28 years old, was one of the few whose final moments were remembered. He had been part of the group from early on, but during the snowshoe escape attempt, the Forlorn Hope, he became too weak to continue. He died in the snow, and those with him later used his body for survival. Before he died, he reportedly spoke about his life back in Illinois, asking those around him to remember him. It was one of the rare moments where a hired man's voice was actually recorded. Augustus Spitzer, about 30, was one of the German immigrants traveling alongside Keseberg. He died at Truckee Lake during the winter, likely from starvation and exhaustion. There are no detailed accounts of his final moments, only that he was among those who did not survive the camps. Bayless Williams, a driver for the Reed family, also died during the winter. His death was attributed more to prolonged malnutrition and physical collapse than sudden starvation. Like many others, he simply weakened over time until his body gave out. Samuel Shoemaker is even less documented. His name appears in records, but little else remains. No detailed account of how he died, no recorded final words, only that he did not make it out. Hiram O. Miller is another whose story fades almost completely from the record. He is listed among the dead, but beyond that, there is almost nothing preserved about his life or his final days. And that absence says something, because while the families were remembered, written about, documented, followed, these men were not. They were workers, laborers, people who helped carry the journey forward, but whose lives were not recorded in the same way. They were there, they worked, they died, and for most of them, that is all that history kept. The largest group of survivors were children. That detail matters because children required less food, and in many cases, adults gave up what little they had to keep them alive. Some walked out. Some were carried. Some were left behind and later rescued. Many lost one or both parents, and yet they survived. Life did not simply resume after the mountains. Some survivors found success. The California Gold Rush, which began just a year later in 1848, brought opportunity, and many were positioned to take advantage of it. James Reed prospered. Others built new lives, but not all of them recovered in ways that could be seen. There were things they had experienced that did not leave, memories that stayed, silences that followed them into every room, every conversation, every year after. Some spoke about it later. Many didn't. The mountains kept the rest. Bodies were never fully recovered. Some were buried later by passing groups. Others remained where they fell. Travelers who crossed the Sierra Nevada in the years that followed reported seeing bones, fragments of wagons, pieces of clothing, and the remains of cabins. Evidence, not of a single moment, but of something that unfolded slowly. After the survivors reached California, life did not simply return to normal. Only the Reed and Breen families remained fully intact. The Donner children who survived were taken in by other families, friends, or acquaintances in the Sacramento Valley and surrounding settlements. Many were orphaned or separated, forced to rebuild their lives without the parents they had lost. Some of the younger children grew up under the care of others, eventually integrating into California society as it rapidly developed during the gold rush era. Others carried the psychological weight of what they had endured for the rest of their lives. Several survivors later spoke about the experience, while others avoided it entirely. The name Donner itself became permanently associated with the tragedy, following them into adulthood. The Murphy survivors settled in Marysville, while the Breen family made their way to San Juan Bautista, where they later purchased the Castro Adobe and operated it as an inn. James Reed's story did not end in the mountains. In many ways, it only began there. After surviving his banishment and making it to California ahead of the others, he did not disappear into the background. He became one of the men actively trying to organize rescue efforts, even as the region itself was unstable, caught in the middle of the Mexican-American War. He later took part in that conflict, serving as an officer in California while still trying to find a way to get help back to his family. Once his family was reunited and the ordeal behind them, Reed rebuilt his life in California with a level of success that stood in stark contrast to what he had come through. He settled in San Jose, where he became a businessman, landowner, and active figure in the growing community. He invested in land, agriculture, and trade, and was among the early settlers who helped shape what would become one of California's key cities. Reed lived nearly 3 decades after the Donner Party, dying in 1874 at the age of 73. His life carried a strange duality. He was remembered both as a man whose decisions helped lead the party into disaster, and as a man whose determination, leadership, and survival helped save lives, including his own family. Unlike many others tied to the tragedy, Reed did not end in isolation or ruin. He rebuilt, he prospered, and he remained part of the world that the others never made it to. Virginia Reed later wrote a detailed account of the journey in a letter that was published in 1847, helping shape how the story was understood across the country. Virginia Reed would eventually marry John Marion Murphy on January 26, 1850. He was a son of Martin Murphy Sr., the patriarch of the large family originally from Ireland. On their wedding day, she was 16 and her groom, who had made a fortune in gold at the Calaveras County mining camp he and his brother Daniel had founded in 1848, was 26. Both were suffused with excitement and a sense of urgency. James Reed had previously threatened to shoot John if he continued to court his daughter. Virginia had slipped out of the house after telling her mother she was going to visit a neighbor but would be back soon, and they couldn't find a clergyman to marry them. In the end, with John's friends standing guard, the couple solemnized their marriage vows before witnesses, then hurriedly mounted waiting horses that took them to an overnight hideaway. Not 5 minutes later, James Reed learned what was happening and gave chase, but it was too late. Virginia's parents ultimately accepted their son-in-law. Certainly after the first grandchild arrived, and perhaps sooner, the newlyweds settled in San Jose and had 9 children, 3 of whom died young. John was engaged in a number of enterprises, including real estate and insurance, and also involved himself in local politics. When he became ill, Virginia assisted him in his business endeavors, and after his death in 1892, she became the first woman on the Pacific Coast to operate a fire insurance business. Isabella Breen, who had been just 1 year old during the winter of 1846 to 1847, would go on to become the last living survivor of the Donner Party, living until 1935, nearly 90 years after the events took place. Even after reaching California, the impact of what had happened did not fade. William Eddy, who had survived the mountains and helped lead rescue efforts, later attempted to carry out his promise to kill Louis Keseberg after Keseberg admitted to eating his son, but was talked out of it. Only 3 mules from the entire journey made it to California. Initial estimates placed 300 to 500 animals, including oxen, horses, mules, cattle, and dogs. Most of them died during the Hastings Cutoff desert crossing. Others were stolen or driven off by indigenous groups or lost due to starvation or exhaustion. By the time the group reached the Sierra Nevada, most of these animals were already gone by way of desertion or of being severely weakened or eaten. The rest of the animals had died along the way. Most of the party's belongings were abandoned, left scattered across the trail, buried in the desert, or lost in the snow. What they had once carried with them as pieces of their lives, tools, keepsakes, provisions, had all been stripped away, leaving only what was necessary to survive. Mary Graves, who had been about 20 years old during the journey, the daughter of Franklin Graves, and one of the few who survived the snowshoe escape known as the Forlorn Hope, had walked out of the mountains when many others could not. She had seen people die. She had endured starvation, the cold, and the decisions that came with it. She carried all of that with her for the rest of her life. Years later, when she was asked about it, she said, "I wish I could cry, but I cannot. If I could forget the tragedy, perhaps I would know how to cry again." And as for Lansford Hastings, the man whose shortcut reshaped this entire journey, he did not face any immediate legal consequences for what happened. In fact, he continued west and eventually settled in California, where he remained involved in politics and expansion efforts. What ultimately pulled him further south was not exile, but opportunity. During the mid-19th century, places like Brazil and Argentina were actively encouraging foreign settlers, professionals, and military minds to come help develop infrastructure, law, and governance. Hastings later became involved in a colonization effort in Brazil, where land and influence were still wide open for someone with ambition and experience in frontier expansion. For men like Hastings, this wasn't unusual. When one frontier closed or became controversial, another opened somewhere else. He spent his later years in South America, where he eventually died in the early 1870s. His name permanently tied to one of the most devastating decisions in westward migration history. The Donner Party is often remembered for one thing: cannibalism. But over time, their story was reduced to that single word. And that word was never the full story. The full story is about time, about how one decision, taking a route that promised to save time, cost them exactly that. Weeks were lost, lives were lost, snow arrived, and once it did, everything changed. What happened in those mountains was not immediate. It was gradual, layered, a series of small losses that turned into something irreversible. Today, thousands of people cross Donner Pass every year. Cars move quickly over roads that took those families months to reach. Snow still falls there. The mountains still look the same. And most people who pass through have no idea what happened on that ground. They weren't lost because they didn't know where they were going. They were lost because they ran out of time. Some of them survived the mountains, but not all of them ever really left.